Hi guys, how you doing? I'm just sitting in my kitchen and I just wanted to make a short video around the context again of food and food choices. Because obviously as I said, try to make this block's a wee bit more emphasis on for a lot of folk on a bit of fat loss, which I understand because the beach season's coming up, and I include myself in that. So I'm sort of making a conscious effort to really try and break out my own comfort zone, because it's something that's been sort of on my mind for a while now, as I mentioned before. So this one that I'm want to talk about this morning is for anyone who, end of the day, there's lots of folk do the sessions, everyone's got their different likes and dislikes when it comes to food, but I understand that, for example, breakfast can be a bit of an issue and cereal is often the go-to meal for a lot of folk. Now in the past I've obviously discussed how cereal is maybe not the best option from a fat loss point of view. We have cornflakes in the house, the kids like it, porridge as well, but they get a bit bored of that from time to time. But when I was in the co-op the other day, there was one thing that actually caught my eye, and it was this here, multigrain fuel hoops, right? The reason it got my eye is because it said it was high in protein, high in fibre. Now, historically, one of the main issues I've always had with cereals, or one of the main issues with cereals when it comes to fat loss, is that generally speaking, they're quite low in protein, and they're quite low. Not all of them, obviously. Well, most of them actually are low in protein, and some of them are also low in fibre, which is the two things that you really need to be like consuming more of, like regularly, if you're trying to achieve fat loss in a sustainable way that's not going to leave you really hungry all the time. So this one caught my eye, and I just wanted to try and draw a bit of attention to it because it is actually quite interesting, and for any cereal lovers out there who are eating cereal for breakfast, it is something you definitely need to consider or reconsider. If you're insisting on going to eat cereal, then you need to try and focus on fibre content and, if possible, protein content. Now, I understand you don't need to. I'm not saying you suddenly need to ditch what you're eating. So if you've got a cereal you like cornflakes, for example, then fine, right? If it does the trick, but you need to be aware though that it doesn't do the trick in so much as there's not a good protein content in it, and there's also not a particularly good fibre content in it. So if you are going to have it, you need to make allowances elsewhere by being aware that you're going to have to make up your protein content elsewhere, which is totally doable, and you need to also make sure you're increasing your fibre intake elsewhere, which is also totally doable. However, the final thing to consider with that, bear in mind, this only applies to you if you're trying to achieve fat loss and you're struggling with it, and have always struggled with it, right? The other thing you do need to consider is that the problem with a low fibre, low protein meal, for example at breakfast, is that it's unlikely to leave you particularly satiated for very long. So therefore you're more likely to then eat something or make a choice later on that's maybe going to lead to further food intake or increased food intake overall over the day. So in other words, when you're consuming foods that are high in protein and fibre or full of vegetables or whatever, I like to use the term preemptive eating, because you're almost preempting the likelihood of then craving. So people think when they make a food choice that it's conscious, but it's not conscious. Sometimes it is, but there's an element of the subconscious attached to it, because the foods you eat will then determine like your satiety hormones, mainly like ghrelin and leptin being the main two. So, and if your satiety hormones are low, then you're going to then on a subconscious level choose to eat more because of the signals it sends to the brain. So it's really important that you understand that there is everything you eat will dictate what you're more likely to eat. It's not impossible to avoid certain things, but it's very difficult depending on the makeup of your general diet, and that's what makes diets difficult to sustain longer term. So if I were you, if you're going to insist on a low fibre, low protein cereal breakfast, then I would also consume, for example, a protein shake or a protein shake or an apple, for example. Or there's our breakfast right there, protein shake and an apple, or protein shake and a banana. But another, as I said, a much better option is going to be something like this multigrain hoops versus the cornflakes. And I'm just going to quickly, I'm obviously not memorised it, but if you look at the nutritional information on the back, so calorie for calorie, they're pretty much the same in terms of like per 100 grams. So for example, if you were to have, 380 roughly, so both of them are the same amount of calories. Let's call it, for simple talking sake, let's call it 400 calories, right? So if you have a large bowl of cereal, you're going to be consuming 400 calories, whether it's the cornflakes or whether it's these, right? But this is where it gets completely different. So the protein content in these, in a 100 grams bowl is 24.1 grams, which is a really good amount of protein. It's a really good a really good amount. When you compare that to the cornflakes, it's only there's only 7 grams of protein in it, which is a very small amount of protein. Now that's not including milk, so if you're adding a bit of milk, you can safely say that your Hoops meal will be up probably closer to 30 grams, and then your cornflakes might come up to 11 or 12 grams, which is still not a lot. So in terms of protein content, it wins significantly. The other thing is your fibre content. So there's only 3 grams of fibre in the cornflakes for the 100 grams, whereas there's just under 8 grams in this one. So you're getting over double the amount of fibre, and you're getting like over 3 times the amount of protein in this. There's also one other thing to consider, and that is that the amount of protein ideally you're going to eat per portion should be around 25 grams to 30 grams as a bare minimum. And the reason for that is because protein is made up of amino acids, and in order to maximize like what's called muscle protein synthesis, you really want to be consuming an amount that contains a certain amount of all the amino acids, including a fairly crucial one which is responsible for maximizing protein synthesis, called leucine. And you need about 3.2 grams of leucine to really maximize the potential benefits of muscle protein synthesis. And in order to get that amount of leucine in, you really need to be consuming around 20, at minimum 20 and upwards grams of protein. So in other words, there's multiple reasons and methods and science behind why protein and fibre and these things are going to be a big win for you in terms of achieving a sustainable fat loss, and also to maximise muscle protein synthesis, which is going to help like with minimising muscle breakdown and also muscle repair. So there's different factors to consider here. So that is another example of why you can't just, if you are focusing on the calories of foods and you're trying to minimise it, you cannot just focus on the calories, because these two cereals are identical pretty much, calorie for calorie. In theory, that would suggest that it would achieve the same outcome, but it absolutely definitely doesn't, for all the reasons I've just listed. So I hope that makes sense, and any questions about it, please ask, but it's definitely something to consider in all the meals you eat, but certainly these sort of like pre-packaged sort of like ready meals like cereals and stuff.